Solid oxide fuel cells convert gaseous fuel electrochemically into electricity. They achieve efficiency exceeding 60%, producing power with a fraction of standard combustion emissions. To function, the ceramic electrolyte inside the cell requires a high degree of ionic conductivity. In traditional designs, achieving that conductivity requires operating temperatures of approximately 1,000 degrees Celsius. Maintaining a machine at 1,000 degrees Celsius creates immense thermal stress. The structural materials undergo severe physical degradation, and the resulting thermal stress fracturing severely limits the commercial lifespan of the fuel cell. The engineering solution is to drop the operating temperature down to an intermediate range, between 500 and 700 degrees Celsius, creating what is known as an ITSOFC. Lowering the temperature successfully prevents the hardware from degrading. However, at 500 degrees, the traditional ceramic chemistry loses its conductivity. To make the intermediate temperature cell work, engineers had to develop a completely new class of solid electrolytes. The replacement material is 10% gadolinium-doped ceria, or GDC-10. By replacing 10% of the cerium atoms with gadolinium, the crystal lattice develops oxygen vacancies, providing the high ionic conductivity required at lower temperatures. Identifying the correct chemical compound solves the temperature problem, but the chemistry must be manufactured into a highly specific physical architecture known as a half cell. The half cell is constructed by depositing the GDC solid electrolyte directly onto a supportive substrate, specifically a nickel oxide GDC anode. This creates a direct mechanical contradiction. The anode substrate must remain highly porous so that fuel gases can flow through it freely. But the GDC electrolyte layer directly on top of it must be perfectly dense. The interface between the materials has zero margin for error. If a microscopic amount of gas crosses the electrolyte barrier, the entire fuel cell short-circuits. The primary bottleneck in manufacturing an ITSOFC is the physical task of building a perfectly solid, microscopically thin, gas-tight seal directly over a surface that resembles a sponge. Dr. Muralidhar Girish Chourashiya's doctoral research at Shivaji University targeted this exact bottleneck, establishing a methodology to reliably synthesize this complex interface. The result was a completely continuous, perfectly dense GDC thin film, measuring exactly 13 micrometers thick. This ultra-thin solid layer successfully anchors to the porous nickel oxide GDC anode below it, leaving zero structural voids where gas could leak through. At precisely 13 micrometers, the film is thick enough to maintain the gas-tight physical barrier, yet thin enough to provide the exact electrical resistance properties needed for power generation. To understand how this seal was achieved, we have to look at the exact parameters that built this interface, layer by layer. Dr. Chourashiya utilized the spray pyrolysis technique, or SPT. Compared to traditional vapor deposition, SPT is highly scalable and cost-effective, making it practical for parochial manufacturing. The process begins by atomizing a liquid chemical precursor into microscopic droplets, spraying them continuously toward a heated target. As a single atomized droplet travels through the heated chamber toward the target substrate, it undergoes a rapid sequence of physical changes. First is solvent evaporation. The extreme ambient heat causes the liquid portion of the droplet to boil off midair, leaving behind a dense cluster of solid precursor particles. Second is precipitation and impact. The newly formed solid precipitate strikes the heated substrate and physically flattens against it. Third is thermal decomposition. The high temperature of the substrate instantly cooks the precipitate, decomposing it into its final crystalline form, the solid GDC oxide. Mastering spray pyrolysis requires calculating the exact carrier gas flow rate, the chamber temperature, and the chemical molarity so that thermal decomposition happens precisely at the moment of impact. In early experiments, detailed in Chapter 5 of his thesis, Dr. Chourashiya successfully optimized these parameters by depositing the GDC film onto perfectly smooth glass substrates. However, moving from glass to the actual target material in Chapter 6 immediately broke the process. The exact same spray parameters completely failed when applied to the rough, porous nickel oxide ceramic. On a porous surface, the droplets cannot easily form a continuous bridge. Instead of layering on top, the atomized precursor soaks directly down into the microscopic pores. Furthermore, the uneven texture of the ceramic causes the solvent to evaporate at different rates across the surface. This uneven drying creates immense internal stress, resulting in massive microcracks across the forming film. To prevent this, Dr. Chourashiya applied a surface modification to the anode-grade ceramic prior to spraying. By treating the top layer of the porous sponge, he altered its physical structure just enough to catch the decomposing droplets without letting them soak through. The integrity of the final thin film relied entirely on preparing the substrate below it. Even with perfect spray parameters and surface modification, the initial 13 micrometer film is still structurally imperfect. It is not yet a gas-tight seal. The final requirement is high-temperature structural annealing. At a microscopic level, the newly deposited film consists of jagged crystal grains packed loosely together, leaving microscopic voids. As extreme heat is applied during annealing, the structure undergoes densification. The individual grain boundaries physically merge, causing the empty voids to shrink and eventually disappear entirely. A visual inspection under a microscope is insufficient to verify the seal. The success of the densification must be proven electrically. This chart displays the results of impedance spectroscopy. This technique sends alternating currents through the material to measure its electrical resistance at different frequencies, plotting the data as a Nyquist semicircle. Because different structural elements react to specific frequencies, the measurements isolate the exact resistance of the solid grain interiors from the resistance of the boundaries where the grains connect. The impedance data confirmed high ionic conductivity with minimal boundary resistance. The loose grains had successfully fused into an unbroken solid electrolyte. Dr. Chourashiya's work bridged a critical gap between theoretical material science and practical manufacturing capabilities. The fundamental research required to achieve this highly specific interface was backed by major national institutions, including the DRDO, the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, and the Department of Science and Technology. By utilizing precise surface modification and high-temperature annealing, the team resolved the mechanical contradiction of the half-cell, placing a perfectly dense electrolyte over a highly porous base. Achieving this with spray pyrolysis proves that the 13 micrometer interface can be manufactured using scalable, cost-effective techniques rather than relying exclusively on small-scale laboratory vapor deposition. By engineering a reliable, gas-tight barrier that functions at intermediate temperatures, we remove the severe thermal degradation from the equation. This specific microstructural achievement provides the exact physical foundation necessary to make solid oxide fuel cells a viable commercial-scale power generation technology.